Today we have Dr. Avanish Kumar from MDI Gurgaon. He's a professor of economics and public policy. Welcome, Dr. Avanish.
Thank you, Akhilesh.
So today we are going to talk about the climate change and its impact on the communities, and you know how it has marginalized uh, these communities and from the discourse and from their uh, living realities. But before we get into the discussion, I would give a brief intro of Professor Kumar. So, Professor Kumar has over 2 decades of experience of working with NGOs, government, corporate houses, academic institutions, and his work mainly revolves around mainstreaming marginalized sections through citizen centric governance, sustainable models of rural livelihoods, social entrepreneurship, and designing corporate social responsible practices to promote sustainable partnership. So he has experience of working with communities in the poorest areas, especially in Jharkhand, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Haryana, and various other states. So he dons many hats, but to me, the core of his work centers around mainstreaming marginalized sections. So, thank you for giving your valuable time, Dr. Avnish. Uh, we are very happy to have you for this interview with us.
Thank you, Akhilesh. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I hope I add some value to the exceptional work that you and your company is doing. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Dr. Avnish, to begin with, as I mentioned that you've done tremendous work uh, around mainstreaming marginalized sections. So, in the given in climate change scenario and recently concluded conference of parties 26th meeting, uh, how do you think communities, especially marginalized and vulnerable communities in the hills, river banks, and coasts, etc., bear the heaviest impact burden of climate change, can be brought into climate change policy narratives or dialogues as active participants?
Yeah, thank you, Akhilesh. I think it's a very pertinent question. I would like to, for the viewers, I think it would be very important that one good thing climate change has done in due course, that it has changed the whole nuances of vulnerability, because this vulnerability of climate change is more equitable in terms of its impact, because it affects rich as well as poor, simultaneously. But the question which you're asking, that of course people who are on the margin has more drastic impact, and that is how I would like to bring it to the discussion. So I would say that if you go through the narratives of climate change discourse, and if you get into IPCC document and also try to analyze, the whole idea of vulnerability has evolved. And if you see in detail, first time I think it got started with 1998, whereby they tried to define, because it's very important. Why do we define it? Because defining anything is like a category. It's like playing a football with no margin on the ground, and there is no boundary, and therefore you are running after each other without any goalpost. So it's very important for any intervention, there is a need to have definition, which actually leads to categorization. What I would like to highlight is when you read the vulnerability from 1998, again it was revised into 2001 in IPC third report. Then again the fourth report had some addition, but largely they talked about the degree to which a system is susceptible or unable to cope with such kind of shocks and risks which are there. Now, what I would like to highlight here is, because as you have shared, my larger work being an anthropologist and working on the issues of public policy, revolves around the marginalized communities. And simultaneously, India government also understand and realize there is a group of community which is perpetually vulnerable, and that is the scheduled tribes. So what I would like to bring here is why the issue of scheduled tribe is not because just I am an anthropologist and I like to bring some kind of nuances of marginality from the margins. But if you see the scheduled tribe, they have triple burden. One of environment or maybe environmental shocks, largely because the environment and natural resource plays an interlocking system in every tribal communities, most of the tribal communities, because their livelihood, religion, lifestyle, way of living, food, everything is dependent on environment and natural resource. So what does it affect? It affects the complete collapse of the system. And in this case, when there is a change in climate, there are consequences of flood, drought, deforestation, and also rain, which is creating so much of problem. So I would say that what I would like to bring today in limited time which we have is that how climate change poses disproportionate risk to vulnerable or marginalized communities due to fragile human and natural system which gets affected or which becomes vulnerable due to climate change. Now, if you see people who are socially and I would call socially and sparsely excluded, if you see like tribal population in India is roughly around 8.6% of the total population, and they cover around 15% of the area. In fact, there was a beautiful study which was done that they are predominantly in the forest dominated districts as well. And there is a kind of correlation which they see that there is an overlap between the forest and natural resource, the tribals, and also the poverty which coexist. Now, this is a tricky thing because it leads to equity issues. And even in the IPCC, if you see Paris Agreement, Article 7.5 actually acknowledges that basically the adaptation action should follow a country-driven, gender-responsive, and participatory and fully transparent approach, taking into consideration the vulnerable groups and communities and ecosystem. But if you see very minutely, when it happens to the marginalized communities, it is not only the system which gets affected. In fact, there are recent studies now in India, I'm talking very specifically to India, that India is basically considered to be the seventh most vulnerable country with respect to climate extremes. If you also see India with the population and the population bulge, that is the size of the population, it also makes it a scale because India has a large population, which all of us know. There are few studies which actually identify 3 out of 4 districts in India are extreme, even hotspots, with 40% of the district exhibiting swapping trains, basically traditionally flood prone areas witnessing more frequent intense droughts and vis-a-vis. So if you see further that coastal areas, 95% of the coastal areas of India, Indian districts are extreme, even hotspots. So what you see is that the frequency and intensity both are increasing rapidly. So what I'm trying to say is the data suggests and the study suggests that there is a rise of 200% of such frequency and intensity since 2005. And there is some kind of calculation which is done that approximately 300 extreme events have hit the country in recent decade. I'm talking about India itself. Now, what does it lead to? Now, fundamental question which I would like to raise today is that who are vulnerable? Everybody is vulnerable with the consequence of climate change. We are in Delhi and everywhere in metros, you see, never seen flood, but today we see flood all over. We see the temperature, which is very different than what used to be during our childhood days. We could see rain all over through the years, which was not common earlier days. So we need to ask a question that vulnerability is almost like universal now today with the climate change. However, the vulnerability which this bottom of the pyramid, that is the tribal groups, they face is something which is exceptional. So my thinking is that if we are talking about vulnerability, climate change, and marginalized communities, then as vulnerability is measured, just to give the clarity, this is interplay between exposure. Exposure is the presence of people's livelihood, species, or ecosystem environmental functions, or economic, social, cultural assets in places and settings that could be adversely affected. So there is an exposure. Then there is a sensitivity, which is what one can absorb. So the degree to which a system is affected. So it's more like a consistency and the kind of affected either adversely or beneficially also. So the difference, the interplay between exposure and sensitivity results into adaptive capacity. Now, what is the difference between the marginalized communities which are living directly under the forest and maybe also within the nature, the beauty of nature? The adaptive capacity has improved with modernization as far as we are concerned with technology and institutional design. There is a technology innovation. If you feel cold, then you can have AC or you can, but these group have least of the technology's advancements. Their living is directly dependent with mediating nature and trying to adopt whatever is most sustainable in that form. And so I'll just give you one example. Once I was doing field work in Jharkhand in among the Birhors, which also happens to be in my native district of Hazaribagh. And many people will be shocked and surprised, at least the young youth who are watching this video or maybe watching later, that they still live within in the thatch roofs, which are basically made of leaves. Now the leaves works like an insulator. But what has happened is that due to pollution and everything, it is affecting their lifestyle. Their food, everything is getting affected. And frankly speaking, within the tribes also, Government of India, which was called technically in Indian policy terms, the primitive tribe, now they call it as particularly marginalized vulnerable groups. Now, if you see the data of vulnerable groups and if you see the extreme vulnerable states, like in climate change discourse, some of these are identified like Jharkhand, Mizoram, Orissa, Chhattisgarh, Assam, Bihar, or Arunachal Pradesh, West Bengal, are most of it basically also getting affected. And within this, the tribal groups, around 700 and so, which are there in India as classified. Now, there exist the particularly vulnerable tribes, which are basically classified by extreme closeness of interplay between population and the environment. Now, there's least interference as far as the modernization, urbanization, or technology is concerned. This was classified first time in India in 1975 by Government of India when they identified the vulnerable communities. They identified 52 of them. And just to give you a scale of their size, there are approximately today 75 of them as classified out of 705 scheduled tribes in India. And they're spread in 17 states of India and union territories as per the last census. But if you see the total count, according to 2001 census, they were approximately 27,000, around 2 lakhs 68,000 population. 12 primitive groups are basically 50,000, and the least number, like Andamanis, are as small as 39 to 43 population. What does this population mean to us? This population means like it is going to be extinct. Sorry to say, but a lot of focus is there to actually think about how to promote or protect these population groups. But still, with the extreme climate, one is the natural forces which are creating pressure on them, with the vulnerability which is increased. And vulnerability is not increased in terms of managing environment, but it is affecting poverty, it is affecting their food, it is affecting their livelihood. So the size which is diminishing to 39 to 43, maybe with this approach which we are going, which is more of reactive and short term, maybe very soon, I'm sorry, and that would be the sad state when this population or the group of tribe may not exist also. So there is a need to look at a very dedicated strategy and reduce the risk. And so just to give you to the audience and to the viewers an understanding about how does this whole idea of the exposure and sensitivity work. If you map, if you're looking at my finger, if you map like exposure, as the exposure rises and the sensitivity increases, there is a decline in the adaptive sensitive capacity. And what happens in this due course of the marginalized communities, because of the least technology and the least institutional design and the facilities, now there is a challenge of adaptation. When there is a lack of adaptive capacity, there will be a threshold which will break and there will be least resilience. So that may lead to a challenge, and that can lead to a further diminishing so-called natural capital, social capital, and also financial capital. So I would say that we need to focus on very dedicated strategies on the population which is directly dependent on nature and where nature is being hit hard because of even minor change and variation. Their exposure and sensitivity is much harder than we can have because we have the capacity to at least may not adopt to it, but maybe redress for a while, not for long term, at least for short term. So what I would like to bring it here is that though there are studies and focus here, but we need to have a very specific district level plan and also plan which is very dedicated how to address these marginalized groups, vulnerable groups, not only tribals, within the tribes, it also becomes very vulnerable for the elderly populations. Now, how do these population will move? Suppose imagine if there is a flood, how do you evacuate a place or how do you run away from flood or maybe rain or even with drought with the aged population? Because the aged care itself is very costly, as you know. So it requires a massive integrated intervention, whether it is public services, be it health, food, livelihood. At the same time, also there is a need to actually have grassroots innovations which can lead to better adaptability and that can lead to resilience among these groups. So at least I'll stop it here, and if you have any further question, then I'll take it forward.
Thank you, Dr. Avnish. You beautifully, I would say, informed our readers vulnerability, how it is measured, and which community as of today is more vulnerable. So this linkage and dependence on the natural resources and environment of the scheduled tribes, how it interplays with their whole subsistence, and how it has not, what I would say, has led to uh, not able to or reduce their adaptability. So you also highlighted this interesting point that technology, use of technology for building the uh, adaptability of these communities. So can you share some examples which
Okay.
come to your mind, which have been used? Uh,
Yeah. I think there are now ample examples with technology innovation, but what is more important, and there are ample studies also on this, when we think about technology, we think that if we have to address marginalized, then we have to think about raw technology, which is very not sophisticated. In fact, studies suggest that what you need to think about is very high-end technology, downscaled in a manner which is usable in the form. Now, I'll just give you one minor example which is going to help you on understanding what does technology mean. By the way, just to simplify this word, because with the jargons and semantics, we make it very confusing. There is a beautiful definition. Any knowledge which is put it in artifact is technology. Now imagine how the local tries to adopt, maybe the tribals. I'll give you one example I was discussing when Indra Awas Yojana, when housing scheme was being built, and this is based on true story. Now there, these tribal groups are given one room set without kitchen, maybe because government can also not afford. Ultimately, we are not a very rich country or developed country like America and others. Now these groups generally used to have hearth outside their house, and which used to protect pollution also because largely they use not a very sophisticated stoves and they use raw wood and everything. Now this was leading to pollution. So if you really want to build a house, you have to think about it that if you're changing the hearth position, then how you can create a technology which reduces indoor pollution and at the same time allows them to be in a safer house. I'll give you one more example by how they adopt as a local knowledge. In fact, unfortunately, India do not recognize in environmental impact assessment the traditional knowledge. There are countries like Canada and other countries, they acknowledge. So I think if you acknowledge the traditional knowledge, how they used to build and try to cope up with the such kind of situation. In fact, one of the beautiful example of Andaminis are that when they avoid uniform or dress, and they used to put their pig fat and mud on their skin, try to basically protect from the insect bites. So there are several technologies which are there now, which is seen as an example. And unfortunately, they are seen in terms of a category of frugal, or what we also call in Hindi is jugaad. What is required is that some research and investment should be done in collaboration with the private sector, because they have the capacity to upscale, whereas government can assist to actually map the innovative skills and potential skills which are there, which can be translated into larger benefiting for this society, benefits for the society. In this case, I think what needs to be done is all these local knowledge which are translated in some form, either in medicine terms or in terms of food, shelter, or even in terms of how to cope with the change in temperature. These are going to help you. And there are several innovations which are happening. Unfortunately, what is happening in India is, or even across the world, that these platforms of innovations are not created where one can share their experiences and upscale it. So it is happening based on try and error, and it is resulting into delay maybe, and also it has a resource scarcity. So therefore I would say, if you see a lot many innovations which I remember, like some initiatives which were done by some NGOs, where they were trying to modify the kitchen chulhas or the stoves, and which was resulting into reduction in indoor pollution. Those are very strategic ones, because ultimately it is resulting into a lot of health or disorders as well. So I would say we need to have more and more such kind of examples, which results into not only protection from such kind of environmental scarcities, but also promote some sensitive kind of livelihoods, which can cope up with the scarcity or the reduction in natural resources, and maybe also rise of temperature.
Thank you, Dr. Avnish. Just one more question. You highlighted the solutions part, what can be done, and the existing technologies which are in play. Just if I were to, because a lot of our viewers would be young viewers, so what would be your message for them? What they can do to become part of, the climate solutions, as you highlighted some of the solutions. So what is it? What message would you like to give to them?
I think one good thing climate change and international governance and collective action has done, that they have made youth very much aware and active. If you see how most of these youths are engaged with. So my suggestion would be that when there is a larger problem, or when there is a larger social problem does not mean caste and gender, the problems which are shared by larger community and population, there is a larger opportunity. And if these young youth with their motivated mind and energy can think about the innovations which are actually in practice for years, and how it can be tweaked or maybe modified, which can be suited to the contemporary situation, it will be a exceptional thing which can happen, not only for the retention of traditional knowledge, but also a traditional wisdom. Because it is very important that sometimes when we are over occupied by scientific inquiry or scientific explanation, we forget the subjective interpretation of its sense. Sense means like how communities view this whole idea of technology and science. So my conclusion or suggestion to all of you would be, that if sense or local sense or the community sense is dovetailed with science, that would be the future solution.
Beautiful thought, Dr. Avnish. I would like to end the interview on that note. Uh, and thanks for giving your valuable time. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.